This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear an incredible interview with Congressman Stearns discussing his exchange with former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson. We also talk about the Fed, the SEC, and much more. For more interviews, remember to go to our homepage at www.kingworldnews.com, where this week we will have John Malden and Michael O'Higgins. Before the start of Congressman Stearns' interview, you will hear a brief 3-minute clip of his riveting exchange with Paulson.
Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Paulson, I hear your pain when you said you're just pained to be on that side of the table answering the gentleman's question. But isn't it true that Goldman Sachs benefited from AIG bailout? They got $13 billion and was the largest recipient of the public funds from AIG. And in fact, creating the collateralized debt obligation, the CDOs, form the basis of the current crisis we have today. But while you were CEO of Goldman Sachs, you were an active part of that business. So my problem is when you say you're pained by AIG, I go back to your bait and switch when you came here into Congress and you suddenly decided instead of buying the toxic loans, you're going to go out and start to give money to these people. So if you didn't have any credibility on the bait and switch, how do you have any credibility today to come before us and tell us that you're pained by AIG?
Well, let me respond.
Do you understand the credibility you have? You came here, you said in this 2.5-page bill that you wanted $750 billion. Then immediately after you got approval from Congress, you changed it. You baited us on, then you switched it, and then you started giving money to these institutions, the top 15 institutions, when all these people who had the loans, you could have worked out a homeowners equity plan around this country to help the people who are actually having their homes foreclosed. And you're helping AIG and you're helping Bank of America and you're bankrupting Lehman Brothers, who is your biggest competition. Isn't there some point you should have recused yourself and said, you know something, all my buddies in Goldman Sachs are over there. You know, I really feel that I shouldn't be making these decisions to make Lehman Brothers go bankrupt, that I really should recuse myself. And the fact is that you're coming here and say you feel the pain of AIG is just outrageous.
Well, I would like to respond to you, Congressman, because I find your statement outrageous.
Okay,
Mr. Paulson.
Well, let me tell you, I have the time, Mr. Paulson. Let me just say one other thing.
No, I just want you to speak into the mic. Pull the mic.
Okay.
Let me just say one other thing here. You know, when you look at, you're saying to us, you support the Obama administration giving more power to the federal regulatory, the Fed. But when you look, the Fed was on, Geithner was on board at the Fed, the New York Fed, dealing with all these institutions. He didn't get it. And then we had this fellow who came up afterwards, Mr. Friedman. He was on the Goldman Sachs board. And he didn't last too long as a Fed chairman. Why? Because he had a conflict of interest. Is it possible that there's so much conflict of interest here that all you folks don't even realize that you're helping people that you're associated with and you should be recusing yourself for America's ethics?
Let me make several comments. The first comment I will say is I came to Congress, I asked for the TARP, and I asked for authority to purchase illiquid assets.
But in 10 days you changed your opinion.
We changed because the situation changed dramatically.
In 10 days?
Joining us now is Congressman Cliff Stearns, the gentleman involved in that exchange with former Treasury Secretary Paulson. There is quite a bit to talk about from that opening clip, Congressman Stearns, but let me just ask about this bait and switch situation so listeners can understand. Mr. Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary at the time, came before you and before Congress and asked for funds for this bailout, which everyone is familiar with by now. And the funds were to be used to purchase toxic assets. And then once the funds were okayed, he immediately began giving the money away instead to certain select institutions. And also, what about his answer that the situation changed in 10 days? That seemed very unconvincing.
Well, first of all, Mr. Paulson was a former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who, while on his watch, they were involved with the subprime mortgages, with credit default swaps and derivatives. So he's very knowledgeable of this type of financial device. When he came into the Secretary of Treasury, he and Bernanke must have known there was approaching a financial crisis. So they had on their watch enough information because the Treasury, as well as the Fed, was providing instant credit because they saw problems. Now, as we move along, he reached a point where not only was Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch and all these people, but AIG, which is the largest insurance company in America, who was providing insurance for all these sophisticated financial devices that were being marketed and sold not only to pension funds but also to banks around the world. So when he came to Congress and said, I'm going to buy the toxic loans, that seemed like a possibility because the toxic loans were the problems in all these financial institutions. But somehow, once he got this approved, he goes back and he realizes that he opened up Wachovia Bank and found he had $350 billion just in one bank in toxic loans. So he said, gosh, I probably can't do that. But he should have known that even before he made his argument for toxic loans, because basically we all knew that you couldn't buy all the toxic loans. I mean, everybody was saying it was like $2 or $3 trillion, maybe approaching $8 trillion. So how in the world could he buy it? So he got back and he settled in his chair and suddenly heard from Goldman Sachs CEO that replaced him. He probably heard from, Lehman Brothers and all of them say, hey, listen, we're in financial crisis here. And unless we get AIG to bail us out, we're going to have trouble. So what does he do? He goes to AIG and starts bailing them out and giving them money. And, of course, AIG gave his Goldman Sachs money. So my point is, maybe it wasn't conscious, but it had to be an unconscious understanding that he is going to help all his buddies, particularly at Goldman Sachs, because Goldman Sachs would be in bankruptcy today if AIG did not give them $30 billion.
So while Paulson is CEO of Goldman Sachs, under his direct watch, as you said, Goldman is packaging these CDOs or collateralized debt obligations.
That's right.
And selling them. And they later blew up on investors. And then Mr. Paulson becomes Treasury Secretary. Isn't this part of what is wrong with the United States today, Congressman Stearns? Because you were asking him, shouldn't he at least have recused himself when there were clearly conflicts of interest?
Yeah, this global economic crisis he's talked about, it's not about money, it's about power. And Wall Street insiders are using the bailout to bail themselves out. And they're the ones, not only the subprime mortgages, but have come up with these very sophisticated financial devices that they can sell. And unfortunately, the three rating systems in America were defaulted here, like Standard & Poor's, and they gave high ratings to these, and so they could sell these things. And these are basically toxic and unregulated derivatives. And so, in a way, he must have known that all these financial institutions, the top 15 in New York, would go under unless he got money to them, unless AIG was propped up so that they could cover their downside with the insurance for these instruments that go bad. So, all of us are just upset that this thing is sort of a coup d'etat, where big money from Wall Street's coming in and taking over the Treasury and giving out money to all these institutions, whereas all the homeowners out there that are being foreclosed and are in mortgages that are adjustable, they're not getting any help. And yet all these big CEOs continue to give themselves bonus, continue to make profits, all because they're using the government, the United States Treasury, and the Federal Reserve to bail themselves out and to make money.
Before we go any further, I want to play a second clip from that exchange that you had with former Treasury Secretary Paulson.
Secondly, I left Goldman Sachs. I sold my shares in Goldman Sachs.
Tax deferred, too. You didn't have to pay any tax on your $200 million.
I sold my shares in Goldman Sachs.
There's a clause that if you come into the administration, you sell your assets, it's tax deferred. You don't have to pay If you had $200 million profit and you didn't have to pay any tax, isn't that true?
Listen,
is that true or not? Yes or no?
It is. You do not pay a profit when someone a tax when someone makes you sell assets.
Maybe that was an incentive for you to become Secretary of Treasury, so you didn't have to pay the tax there.
So by coming in as Treasury Secretary for just a short period of time, Mr. Paulson avoided paying any taxes whatsoever on $200 million of gains. Is that correct?
That's correct.